The war had no official name yet. That was the first thing Sergeant Marcus Hale noticed when the deployment orders came through, a blank field where the conflict designation should have been. Just a set of coordinates, a unit call sign, and a threat classification that read, Unknown/contact protocols pending. In the history of human military engagement, contact protocols pending had never once meant anything good. Karev Station sat at the outer edge of what cartographers had started calling the threshold belt, a loose scattering of rocky bodies and abandoned relay posts occupying the no-man's land between confirmed human space and whatever lay beyond it. For 11 months, the 14th Forward Reconnaissance Battalion had been stationed there, watching signals that didn't behave like signals, tracking debris fields that moved against orbital mechanics, and filing reports that disappeared into classification layers so deep that even their commanding officers stopped asking follow-up questions. Marcus had been in the military for 9 years. He had done 2 tours on the Martian surface during the early colonial disputes, 1 rotation on Europa Station during the submarine farming riots, and a period he didn't discuss, doing things he wouldn't describe, in a place listed only as Sector 7 Foxtrot in his service record. He was not easily rattled. But Karev Station rattled him. Not because of what was out there. Because of the waiting. The way the long-range sensors would ping something massive and coherent, and then it would be gone before triangulation could confirm a shape. The way the night shift kept turning in reports about low-frequency vibrations in the hull plating that the station's engineers couldn't trace to any mechanical source. The way the newest recruit, a young woman named Corporal Yeva Solis, had started keeping a personal log she refused to let anyone read. "You think they're watching us?" Solis had asked him once, during a meal period that neither of them had actually eaten much of. "I think something is," Marcus had said. That was the honest answer. The contact happened on a Tuesday. He would remember that detail with strange clarity for the rest of his life, the mundane specificity of it. A Tuesday. He had just finished a secondary equipment check on the outer access corridor, a task so routine he could perform it in the dark, when the motion sensors on airlock 7 tripped a yellow alert. Not red. Yellow. That was the second strange thing. A breach or hostile approach would have triggered red immediately. Yellow meant the system had detected something but couldn't classify it. Yellow meant the AI threat assessment module had looked at the incoming data and essentially said, "I don't have a category for this." Marcus was the closest personnel. He acknowledged the alert on his wrist panel and moved toward airlock 7 with his sidearm drawn and his helmet sealed, following protocol exactly as written. He was not heroic about it. He was methodical. What he found in the outer airlock was not a weapon, not a scout drone, not any piece of hardware he recognized. It was a living creature. Roughly bipedal, though the proportions were wrong in ways that took his brain a moment to process. The torso too long, the joints bending at angles that suggested a skeletal structure fundamentally different from anything terrestrial. The skin, if it was skin, had a texture like overlapping ceramic plates, matte gray-green, and where the plates had cracked along the left side of the creature's body, there was something dark and wet seeping through. The face, if that was the right word, had no visible eyes. Instead, there was a broad, flat sensory structure across what might have been the forehead, and below it, a mouth analog that was opening and closing in a rhythm that might have been speech or might have been the mechanical reflex of something dying. It was unarmed. That registered before anything else. No weapon profile Marcus could identify. Hands, or what served as hands, were empty and open. It was also very clearly critically injured. Marcus stood in the airlock for 4 full seconds, which is longer than it sounds when something is bleeding in front of you. Then he holstered his sidearm. "Solis," he said over comms, keeping his voice level. "I need a medical kit and I need Petrov from Xenobiology on airlock 7. Don't run. Don't make noise. Just come." There was a pause. "Sergeant," Solis said carefully, "what is it?" Marcus looked at the creature. The sensory structure on its face was oriented toward him. Whatever it used for perception, it was using it now, focused entirely on him, and something in the quality of that attention, the absolute stillness of it despite obvious pain, made him think with a certainty he couldn't explain and wouldn't try to. It came here on purpose. It came here because it had nowhere else to go. "I don't know," Marcus said. "That's the whole problem. Come anyway." He crouched down to the creature's level, close enough that if it had been hostile it could have reached him. He did this not because it was tactically advisable. He did it because it seemed, in that moment, like the correct human thing to do. To make yourself small in front of something suffering. To say, with your posture rather than your words, "I am not going to hurt you." The creature went very still. Then, slowly, one of those open hands moved, not toward him but upward toward its own chest, where something beneath the cracked plate skin pulsed with faint bioluminescence. Blue-green. Slow. Like a heartbeat that had decided to be visible. Marcus did not know in that moment that he was looking at a gesture of profound surrender in the creature's culture. He did not know that showing the light beneath the plates was the equivalent of exposing one's throat, an act performed only in the presence of someone trusted completely, or someone from whom one accepted death. He didn't know any of that yet. He just stayed crouched and he stayed calm and he waited for Solis and Petrov to arrive, watching that slow blue-green pulse and thinking that whatever this was, whatever came next, the right thing had already been done in the past 4 seconds. The war that had no name was about to get one. And the debt that would take 12 years to repay had just been born. Dr. Alexei Petrov had spent 6 years studying extremophile bacteria in the ice shelves of Enceladus. He had written 3 papers on non-carbon-based metabolic pathways that most of his colleagues considered theoretically interesting but practically useless. He had applied for the Karev station posting specifically because the assignment profile mentioned potential non-terrestrial biological phenomena, and he had thought that meant unusual mineral formations. He was not prepared. Not medically, his training covered emergency field biology well enough that his hands didn't shake as he worked. What he was not prepared for was the quality of attention the alien gave him while he treated it. The way that flat sensory structure tracked every movement with what felt, uncomfortably, like evaluation. Not the blank observation of an animal. Something more deliberate. More patient. "It's conscious," Petrov said about 20 minutes into the procedure, not because anyone had asked but because he needed to say it out loud. "Obviously," said Marcus, who was crouched against the opposite wall of the medical bay watching. "I mean it's conscious. It's tracking my instrument movements. It anticipated the incision line on the secondary treatment. It shifted its body to give me better access before I'd repositioned. It understood what I was about to do." Marcus said nothing. "Marcus, it speaks." "I know. Not in any language in our database. But the pattern structure, I've been running it through the acoustic analyzer while I work. It's not random vocalization. There's grammar in there. Syntax. It's telling us something." "I know that too." Petrov looked up from his work. "How long did you know?" "Since the airlock," Marcus said. "Since it showed me the light." The alien, which the station's informal log had already begun calling the Visitor, a name that stuck with the stubborn practicality of military shorthand, stabilized over the following 18 hours. Not fully. Whatever had damaged it had done so extensively, and Petrov was frank about the limits of his ability to treat an organism whose physiology he was inventing a framework for in real time. But it stabilized enough to be conscious more than it was unconscious, and conscious enough to continue doing the thing that was rapidly consuming every spare hour of the xenobiology team's attention. It was trying to communicate. Not passively. Actively, urgently, with a focus that Petrov described in his logs as a quality I can only call desperation filtered through extraordinary discipline. It wasn't panicking. It was working. There was a systematic quality to its communication attempts. It would try something, observe the human response, adjust, try again. It was running its own contact protocol. The breakthrough came on the 4th day, and it came not from Petrov or the linguistics AI or any of the 3 communication specialists who had been quietly scrambled to Karev station under cover of a routine personnel rotation. It came from Corporal Yeva Solis, who had been sitting with the Visitor during an overnight watch because she hadn't been able to sleep and she'd figured, with the pragmatic logic of someone who grew up with younger siblings, that sick things didn't like being alone. She had been showing it things on her personal tablet. Not trying to communicate, just filling the silence. Photos from home. A map of the solar system. Diagrams she liked, schematics, patterns. Things she found visually interesting. When she got to a star map she downloaded for personal navigation practice, the Visitor went absolutely rigid. Then it reached out, slowly waiting for her permission before it touched the screen, and moved its finger to a cluster of systems near the outer threshold belt. Then it made a sound. Then it moved its finger in a sweeping gesture, across the map toward human space. Then it made a different sound, lower, with a quality that the acoustic analyzer would later flag with a notation Petrov had never expected to type. Probable distress marker. Solis looked at the map. Then at the Visitor. Then at the map again. "You're trying to warn us," she said quietly. The Visitor couldn't understand the words. But something in her tone, the shift from neutral observation to recognition, reached it. The bioluminescence beneath its plates changed. Still blue-green but faster now. Brighter. Solis hid her comms. "Sergeant Hale," she said. "You need to see this." What followed was 72 hours of the most intensive cross-species communication attempt in human history, conducted in a medical bay on a second-tier border station with equipment that was never designed for it, by a team that was mostly improvising. The linguistics AI burned through 6 iterations of its own base model trying to find pattern matches. Petrov stopped sleeping. The 3 communication specialists who had arrived expecting to observe, found themselves at the center of something that none of their training had quite anticipated. What emerged, slowly, imperfectly, with enormous gaps and an error rate that made every conclusion provisional, was this. The visitor was a member of a species that had no single name humans could pronounce but which the translation matrix, working on contextual inference, rendered as something close to the Veth. The Veth were not the dominant power in the region beyond the threshold belt. They were, by most measures of interstellar politics, a secondary species, numerous, old, technologically sophisticated, but positioned between larger and more aggressive civilizations in a way that had made diplomacy and survival a single continuous practice across their entire recorded history. The visitor was, specifically, a member of a Veth diplomatic intelligence unit. Not a soldier. Not a scout. Something more like an analyst, trained to observe, assess and report on civilizations their own kind hadn't yet formally contacted. It had been observing the humans of Karev Station for 4 months. It had been injured not by accident but by deliberate action, attacked by a third party that did not want first contact between humanity and the Veth to succeed. And the warning it was trying so urgently to deliver was not about the Veth. It was about what was coming behind them. Marcus stood in the medical bay doorway when Petrov read him the summary, and he was quiet for a long time. How long? He finally asked. Petrov looked at his notes. Best estimate, given the margin for translation error, between 8 and 14 months before the leading edge of what it's describing reaches the threshold belt. And what is it describing? Petrov set his notes down. Outside, through the station's small observation port, the stars were very still and very distant. A fleet, he said. Not the Veths. Something older. Something that doesn't negotiate. He paused. It says they've already taken 6 systems. It says the Veth lost 2 colony worlds in the last cycle. It says, he stopped. Say it, Marcus said. It says humanity is next. And it says, Petrov's voice had gone careful in a way it hadn't been before. It says we're the first civilization it has ever encountered that it thought might actually be able to stop them. The visitor was watching Marcus from its bed, the slow blue-green light pulsing beneath its plates. Marcus met what he assumed were its eyes, even though there were no eyes there, just that broad sensory structure, oriented on him with complete attention. He thought about 4 seconds in an airlock. About a small decision that had seemed, at the time, like the only reasonable one. He thought about debts. Give me a line to command, he said. Encrypted. Priority 1. He looked back at the visitor. Tell it, he said to Petrov, that we're listening. The encrypted report Marcus filed ran to 47 pages, including Petrov's biological assessments, Solis's annotated star map, the acoustic analyzer's linguistic breakdown, and a personal summary in which Marcus used language that was, by the standards of military communication, extraordinarily direct. He wrote, I am confident this is not a deception. I am confident the threat it describes is real. I am confident that the timeline is shorter than we would like and that the appropriate response to this situation is not continued observation. He submitted it at 0340 station time and went to sleep for 6 hours, which was the most strategically sound thing he could have done because the response, when it came, was the kind of institutional reaction that required rest to engage with calmly. The short version was, interesting. Continue monitoring. Do not alter current protocols. A review team will be dispatched within 90 days. 90 days. Marcus read that twice. Then he forwarded the timeline estimate, 8 to 14 months, with a note that said only, please reconcile these 2 numbers. No response came. This was not, Marcus understood, malice. It was bureaucratic physics. The information he was reporting was so far outside the existing decision-making framework that the framework was essentially trying to reject it the way a body rejects a foreign object. Not because it was wrong but because there was no established procedure for accepting it. Human military command structure was extremely good at responding to threats that resembled previous threats. It was considerably less good at responding to things that had no precedent in the record. What Marcus did next was technically within regulations if you read them generously, and was the kind of decision that either ends a career or defines one. He contacted his uncle. Admiral Yusuf Hale had spent 31 years in the Unified Earth Fleet, the last 9 of which had been in the Strategic Planning Directorate, which meant he had both the clearance to receive what Marcus was about to send him and the institutional position to do something about it. He was also, more importantly, a man who had raised his nephew to understand that rules exist to produce good outcomes and that when following a rule produces a bad outcome, the rule has failed, not the person. Marcus sent him everything. Raw data, unfiltered. Petrov's notes. Solis's documentation. The acoustic analysis. The star maps. His own assessment. He attached a cover message that said, "I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to look." Admiral Hale looked. He called in 2 favors, accessed 3 classified databases that the standard review process would have taken weeks to unlock, and cross-referenced the visitor's warning against 6 months of deep space sensor data that had been sitting unanalyzed in a threshold belt monitoring archive because no one had been assigned to process it. The patterns were there. They had been there for months. They had simply been below the threshold that would have triggered an automatic alert, and no human analyst had been looking at that data with the right question in mind. Admiral Hale sent Marcus a single message in reply: "I see it. Give me 72 hours. Those 72 hours were, for Marcus, among the longest of his life. Not because he doubted his uncle but because of what was happening in the medical bay. The visitor was getting worse. Petrov had been honest from the beginning about the limits of his treatment capability, and those limits were now becoming apparent in real terms. The internal damage was more extensive than initial scans had suggested. Organs or organ equivalents whose function Petrov was still mapping were failing in ways he could observe but not fully address. The visitor was aware of this. Marcus could tell because the communication attempts, instead of slowing as its strength diminished, were intensifying, as if it was trying to compact everything it hadn't yet said into whatever time remained. Marcus spent most of those 72 hours in the medical bay. Not talking, they still didn't have enough of a shared language for conversation in any real sense. But present. Because it seemed to matter, that presence, and because there was something he needed to understand before Command's response came in and things got complicated. On the second night, through a combination of the translation matrix, Solis's annotated star maps, and a communication technique the visitor had developed involving patterns tapped against the medical bay wall in sequences that the acoustic AI was slowly learning to parse, Marcus got one piece of information he hadn't asked for. The visitor had a name. The full version was unpronounceable, a sequence of sounds that required a vocal anatomy humans didn't have. But the first element of it, stripped to its simplest component, translated phonetically to something close to Kale. Marcus told it his name in return. First name only, the way you introduce yourself to someone in a hospital, because that was the register this felt like. The bioluminescence flared briefly warmer. Almost gold instead of blue-green. Kale, Marcus said quietly. The pattern tapping on the wall changed rhythm. The translation matrix flagged it as a probable affirmative. 71 hours and 40 minutes after sending the message, Admiral Hale came back. The message was longer this time. It outlined a new classification level being established, a task force being quietly assembled, and a set of orders being prepared for Karev Station that would replace the existing continue monitoring directive with something considerably more substantive. The last line read, "You were right. We're moving. Keep that creature alive if you can." Marcus looked at that last sentence for a moment. Keep that creature alive. He thought about the name. About the gold light. About the 8 months remaining in the most optimistic translation of the timeline. He sent back a one-line response. Working on it. Then he went back to the medical bay, pulled up a chair, and spent the rest of his watch shift learning the wall-tap language that was, slowly, word by word and concept by concept, becoming the foundation of the first real conversation between humanity and the Veth. The fleet that was coming had no idea what it was walking into. Not because humanity was invincible. But because humanity, when it finally understood a threat, had a very particular quality, the same quality that the visitor had identified from 4 months of observation, and which it had risked its life to cross the border and report. Humans did not give up on things they had decided to protect. Kale had decided, somewhere in those 4 months of watching, that this was worth betting everything on. Looking at the slow gold pulse in the dark of the medical bay, Marcus was beginning to think the bet was sound. The task force had no public name. Internally, it was designated Joint Preparation Group 7, which was deliberately bureaucratic and deliberately boring, because the single greatest operational security advantage humanity possessed in the 8 months between Kale's warning and the projected arrival of the Convergence fleet was that the Convergence did not know humanity had been warned. JPG-7 operated under the assumption that this advantage had a shelf life. The third party that had attacked Kale, still unidentified, their motives murky but their intent clear, might report back to the Convergence. The Convergence's own intelligence apparatus might detect the activity near the threshold belt. Some combination of sensor data and inference might give them away. So JPG-7 worked as if it had 6 months, not 8, and it worked quietly. The people assembled were not the loudest names in human defense. They were not the admirals who gave speeches. They were analysts, engineers, logisticians, and strategists, the category of person who is extraordinarily good at a specific technical problem and who tends to be invisible until the specific technical problem becomes the most important thing in the world. Admiral Hale chaired the strategic committee. The operational planning was led by a woman named Commander Isabel Okoro, who had spent a decade designing defensive infrastructure for the outer colonial stations and who had a reputation, among people who knew her work, for what her colleagues called adversarial patience. The ability to look at a threat from its own perspective and find the angles it would exploit before it exploited them. Okoro's first assessment, delivered to the committee 3 days into JPG-7's existence, was blunt. "We cannot defeat a fleet this size in direct engagement," she said. "The numbers don't work. The Veth lost 6 systems and 2 colony worlds to this force, and the Veth are a civilization roughly 300 years ahead of us in sustained spaceflight experience. Direct confrontation is not the path." There was silence around the table. "What is the path?" Admiral Hale asked. "We make the path expensive," Okoro said. "Not impossible. Expensive. We make every meter of advance cost them more than they projected. We design engagement conditions that favor our strengths, which are not our weapons. They're our adaptability, our logistics density, and our willingness to use the terrain." She pulled up a map of the threshold belt. "Space isn't empty. We've been treating it like it is. The belt is full of resources. We start using them." What followed over the next 8 months was, by any objective measure, one of the most remarkable logistics operations in human history, remarkable specifically because of how little of it was visible. No mass mobilization. No public draft. No emergency broadcasts. The civilian population of humanity went about its business in reasonable ignorance while, in the background, a network of manufacturing facilities quietly shifted production priorities. 1,000 engineers redesigned defensive infrastructure using principles borrowed from submarine warfare and mountain fortification, and 63 small teams deployed to the threshold belt to turn rocks and ice and abandoned relay stations into something that was not quite a fortification but would function like one. Marcus was part of none of this directly. He was still on Karev Station, which had been reclassified from a monitoring outpost to a forward coordination hub, a change that involved considerable new equipment and personnel but which did not, fundamentally, change his daily reality, which was the medical bay. Kale had not died. This was, medically speaking, something Petrov described as an outcome I am professionally obligated to call a recovery, while personally acknowledging that I have no idea how it happened. The Veth physiology had responded to the combined treatment, crude and improvised as it was, and to something else that Petrov noted carefully in his logs: environmental stability, consistent temperature, consistent light cycles, regular presence of familiar individuals. "It's not just the treatment," Petrov told Marcus quietly. "It's continuity. I think, and I want to be careful about how much I'm projecting here, I think being in a place where it knew the people, where the routine was predictable, where nothing new was threatening, I think that did as much as the medicine." Marcus thought about that. About what it would mean for a creature to drag itself across the border to a species it had never met, badly injured, essentially betting its survival on the response of strangers. And then to find that the strangers were, well, what they were. The language situation had improved dramatically in 8 months. Not to fluency, nothing like it, but to a functional working communication capability that used a hybrid system. Part adapted Veth gestural language, part acoustic pattern translation, part the kind of shorthand that develops between people who spend significant time together under pressure and learn to read context. Kale and Marcus could have a conversation. Not an effortless one, but a real one. This was how Marcus learned that the third party that had attacked Kale was not working for the Convergence. It was working for a faction within the Veth, one that believed the correct response to the Convergence's advance was accommodation rather than resistance, and that Kale's mission to warn humanity was, in their view, dangerously provocative. This was how Marcus learned that Kale had not been authorized for the crossing. The mission had been personal. Kale had taken the warning to humanity because Kale had reviewed the data on humanity and had reached a conclusion that even Kale's superiors had not, that this was a species worth warning, worth the risk, worth the bet. Why? Marcus asked one evening using the hybrid system, imperfect but functional. Kale was quiet for a moment. The bioluminescence shifted. A complex pattern Marcus had learned to read as I am looking for the right way to say this. Then Cale tapped a simple sequence on the wall beside the bed. The translation matrix rendered it as, because you stayed. Marcus didn't understand immediately. In the airlock? Another tap sequence. Not only. Before. Watching. You stayed on this station. Years. Watching something you couldn't identify. Not attacking. Not retreating. Watching. That's just orders, Marcus said. Cale's sensory structure shifted toward him with what Marcus had learned to read as disagreement. No, Cale tapped. I watched many species in my work. Most, when they see something they cannot identify near their border, they attack it or they hide from it. You watched it. You sent people to understand it. You argued with each other about what to do. A pause, the bioluminescence cycling through something complicated. You treated uncertainty like a problem to solve. Not like a threat to eliminate. Marcus sat with that for a moment. And that was enough to risk your life on. It was enough to bet my life that the species which saved it would be worth saving in return, Cale replied. Outside, 8 months had nearly elapsed. In the deep dark of the threshold belt, something vast and old and confident in its own invincibility was moving toward a border it had already decided was the next thing it would cross. It had never encountered a species that watched things patiently, that argued about uncertainty, that turned rocks and ice into carefully designed problems waiting to be walked into. It had also never encountered a species that paid its debts. It was about to meet one. The Convergence's advanced formation entered the threshold belt on a Wednesday, 11 days ahead of JPG-7's most optimistic timeline projection and 4 days inside the pessimistic one, a discrepancy that Commander Okoro had, with typical rigor, planned for. Their formation was impressive. Marcus watched the sensor feeds from Karev Station's upgraded monitoring suite and understood, in a visceral way that threat assessments on a screen had never quite produced, why 6 Veth systems had fallen. The Convergence moved through space with the absolute confidence of a force that had never encountered effective resistance. A confidence visible in the geometry of their advance, the spacing of their vessels, the complete absence of anything resembling a defensive posture. They did not expect to need one. They had, by Cale's account, never needed one. Okoro had spent 8 months building an education for them. The first lesson was the belt itself. What had been empty space, asteroid clusters, dead relay posts, frozen debris, was no longer what their long-range sensors had mapped on their last survey pass. The modifications were not dramatic. Nothing that would read as a weapons platform or a fortification from distance. What JPG-7's engineering teams had constructed was more subtle. A network of repositioned masses, carefully calculated, that altered the gravitational microenvironment of the approach corridors in ways that were not intuitive unless you had done the specific mathematics for this specific area. The Convergence's lead formation began adjusting trajectory as their local navigation systems registered the inconsistency between their charts and reality. Reasonable. Competent. Exactly what a confident, experienced fleet would do. The adjustment put them into the second lesson. Okoro had described her defensive philosophy to the Strategic Committee as making them choose between bad options. The repositioned masses in the belt didn't block the approach corridors, they compressed them. A fleet that wanted to maintain formation had to concentrate. A fleet that concentrated became easier to address with the next layer. What humanity had deployed in those compressed corridors was not, it should be said, a fleet of equal size. JPG-7 had been honest throughout. Matching the Convergence in direct tonnage was not achievable in 8 months and probably not in 8 years. What humanity had deployed was a distributed network of automated assets, small, fast, most of them expendable, that existed not to destroy the Convergence's fleet but to complicate it. Every autonomous platform that activated forced the Convergence to respond. Every response consumed time, attention, and positioning. Every repositioning in the compressed corridors created new constraints. The Convergence had never fought a battle where the terrain worked against them. They were learning quickly. Marcus could see it in the changing patterns of their formation adjustments, but learning quickly and learning fast enough are different things when someone has had 8 months to design the curriculum. On Karev Station, Marcus watched the feeds and did his job, which was to maintain coordination between the forward positions and the command structure further back. He was good at this, at holding the shape of a large operation in his mind and identifying where information wasn't flowing correctly. But he was also watching something else. Cale was watching the feeds too. The station had a secondary monitoring room that Petrov had quietly arranged access to, the logic being that Cale's familiarity with Convergence operational patterns might provide interpretive value during the engagement. Kale sat in front of the sensor display with the absolute stillness that Marcus had learned over 14 months, meant the deepest possible concentration. And at some point in the third hour of the engagement, when the convergence's formation had made its fourth major adjustment and the patterns on the feed were beginning to look less like a confident advance and more like a navigation problem that kept getting worse, Kale did something Marcus had never seen before. The bioluminescence changed color. Not the blue-green of calm communication or the gold of warmth or the complex cycling of difficult thought. Something new. A deep, clear, steady blue that Marcus didn't have a translation for. "What is that?" he asked quietly. Kale turned the sensory structure toward him. A long moment. Then a tap sequence on the chair arm, slow and deliberate. The matrix rendered it. In my language there is a word. It translates approximately as, the feeling when you have bet everything on something uncertain and you discover you were right. Marcus looked at the feeds. At the convergence formation continuing to compress, continuing to react, beginning, unmistakably, to look for a way to disengage and recalculate. "Relief," he offered. Kale tapped. "Larger than relief. Relief is the absence of fear. This is the presence of something." Pause. The blue light steady. "Hope is the closest word you have. But it is hope for something already happening. Not something wished for." Marcus watched the feeds for another moment. "We haven't won yet," he said. "No," Kale replied. "But you have made them uncertain. A force that has never been uncertain is now uncertain. That is," a longer pause, the blue light warming slightly toward that familiar gold. "That is not a small thing. It was not a small thing. The convergence did not break. They were too experienced, too capable for that. What they did, over the next 36 hours, was something that JPG-7's analysts had listed as a secondary hoped-for outcome rather than a primary objective. They stopped. Not retreated. Stopped. Held position in the outer belt and did something that their behavioral models, based on everything the Veth knew about them, suggested they were not supposed to do. They sent a signal. Not an attack frequency. Not a navigation beacon. A directed transmission, aimed at Karev Station, in a format that the translation systems eventually identified as a communication protocol. Old, archaic, one that the Veth's historical records showed the convergence had not used in over 200 years. The last time the convergence had used that protocol, according to Kale, was when they had encountered a civilization whose defenses they didn't immediately understand and needed time to assess. The last time the convergence had needed time to assess, it had taken them 4 years to eventually overcome the civilization in question. That civilization no longer existed. "What do we send back?" Admiral Hale asked in the command channel. There was a silence that lasted several seconds. The weight of it distributed across every node in the communication network, felt in every operation center from Karev Station to the inner system. Marcus looked at Kale. Kale looked back. Then Kale reached over, slowly, and tapped a sequence on the console edge. Simple. 4 symbols. The matrix rendered it, answer. But speak first of the living, not the dead. Marcus understood. Whatever humanity said in the next transmission would set the frame for everything that followed. The convergence expected either aggression or capitulation. Those were the 2 responses their experience had given them. Humanity was about to offer a third option. Not because humanity was certain it would work, but because it was the option that left the most paths open, and because the species that had watched the unknown patiently for years, that had stayed when others would have fled or attacked, was not done choosing patience yet. "Draft a response," Marcus told the communications team. "Tell them, we received your signal. We are prepared to continue this conversation. We have noted your hesitation and will not exploit it while talk is possible." A beat. "Tell them we have someone they should speak with." Kale's bioluminescence flared gold. Full and warm and certain. The negotiation took place over 17 days, conducted via relay transmission across the belt, in a 3-way communication structure that had no precedent in any diplomatic handbook ever written. On one end, the convergence speaking through a transmission protocol that Kale identified as being handled by their equivalent of a strategic assessor, not a political figure but an analytical one, a designation that told Kale they were being taken seriously in a way that surprised even them. The convergence did not send its diplomatic apparatus to conversations it considered routine. It sent analysts when it was genuinely uncertain. On another end, JPG-7's communication team, fronted by a linguist named Dr. Amara Nwosu who had been working with the hybrid translation system for 6 months and who possessed, in Petrov's assessment, an intuitive grasp of communicative intent that transcended the technical limitations of the tools she was using. In the middle, performing a function that had no name, Kale. What Kale did was not translate in the technical sense. The convergence did not share a language with the Veth any more than the Veth shared a language with humans. What Kale provided was context, the ability to flag when a human statement would be interpreted in a culturally catastrophic way by the convergence's assessment framework, and to suggest phrasings that conveyed the same meaning through different registers. Kale was, in Marcus's assessment, the most important diplomatic asset humanity had ever fielded, and had been improvised into the role in the back of a medical bay on a border station. Marcus was not part of the negotiation directly. His role during those 17 days was logistical and security coordination, ensuring the forward positions in the belt maintained their posture without triggering escalation, monitoring the convergence's fleet for movements that might signal a breakdown of the communication track. It was important work and it kept him occupied. But every day at the end of his shift, he went to the monitoring room where Kale worked. The conversations they had during those 17 evenings were, in some ways, the most direct they had managed in all their time together. The pressure of the negotiation seemed to have clarified Kale's use of the hybrid language. The urgency had burned away the hesitancy. On the third evening, Marcus asked, "What do they actually want?" "The convergence. Not the expansion, under that." "What drives it?" Kale was quiet for a moment. "Security." The tap sequence came. "But the kind of security that requires that nothing can threaten you. Not the kind that builds defenses. The kind that eliminates anything that could become a threat. Preemptive dominance. There is a history." A pause. "Bioluminescence cycling. A long time ago in their history, what they remember of it, there was a civilization that they permitted to grow. That permitted became existential. They have never permitted again. They're afraid. A civilization that has not been afraid in 200 years still carries the shape of ancient fear. It becomes policy. Policy becomes identity." Kale's sensory structure shifted toward the feed, where the convergence fleet still held its position in the outer belt, vast and patient. They do not know they are afraid anymore. They think they are simply correct. Marcus thought about that. And us? What do they see when they look at us? The longest pause yet. The bioluminescence went through several cycles. "Something they did not predict," Kale finally replied. "A species young enough to have no history with them. No pattern they can map. You fought them in the belt in a way they had not encountered and did not understand. You then did not pursue. You offered conversation. You presented," a pause, "me. Why does presenting you matter? Because I am Veth. Because the Veth have been telling the convergence for decades that resistance is unwise. Because I crossed the border and warned you, and here I am, speaking from your station." Another pause. "It tells them that the Veth made a choice. And if the Veth made a choice, then choice is possible. And if choice is possible, then they can choose something different too," Marcus said. "Perhaps." The gold light, cautious. "This is what the negotiation is trying to find out." On the 9th day, the convergence's analytical representative asked a question that Dr. Nwosu flagged as potentially pivotal. "Why did you not pursue when you had positional advantage?" The honest answer was that they hadn't had as much positional advantage as the convergence apparently believed. The belt network had functioned better than expected but was never going to neutralize a force that size. It had been a delay and a complicating factor, not a defeat mechanism. If the convergence had pressed the advance, the engagement would have become something much worse. But Nwosu, after consultation with the team and with Kale, sent a different kind of answer, one that was also true. She sent, "Because our objective was never your destruction. Our objective was your attention." There was a 6-hour silence after that transmission. The longest gap in the negotiation. Then clarify. Nwosu sent, "You have been advancing through space destroying civilizations you determined to be future threats. We determined that the most effective response to this was not to be the next civilization you destroy, but to be the first civilization that made you reconsider the logic." Another silence. Shorter. "You believe you can make us reconsider?" Nwosu looked at Kale. Kale tapped, "Tell them we already have. This conversation is the proof." On the 17th day, the convergence fleet in the outer belt began to move. 4:43 minutes, every human operations center in the threshold belt was at maximum alert, watching the formation shift, reconfiguring, waiting for the shape that would tell them whether the conversation had succeeded or failed. The formation completed its movement. It had withdrawn to the far edge of the belt. Not left entirely, not retreated to their own space, but pulled back to a position that, in spatial terms, was clearly non-threatening. The final transmission they sent was short, and Kale took a long time rendering it, not because the language was difficult but because, as Kale explained afterward, the register was one Kale had never personally encountered in any convergence communication. It translated as, "We will hear more. Send your speaker again in 30 days. Not an agreement. Not a concession. But a continuation." In the monitoring room, there was a silence that had a texture to it, the specific silence of people who have been operating at sustained maximum tension for 17 days and have just been told they can breathe. Cale reached out and tapped Marcus's forearm. Not a translation sequence. Just contact. Marcus put his hand over Cale's. The plates were warm. The light beneath them was gold. 30 days, Marcus said. Cale tapped 30 days. Outside, the fleet held its position at the edge of everything. Waiting. In 30 days, humanity would send its speaker again. It had turned out that the most important thing humanity sent to the table wasn't a weapon or a strategy. It was someone who had learned, over 14 months in a medical bay on a border station, what the Veth and the Convergence and every civilization in between had never found a way to offer each other: the willingness to stay in the room. 12 years is a long time in any life. In the life of an interstellar diplomatic framework constructed from scratch between three civilizations that had no shared history, no shared biology, and no established trust, 12 years is barely the beginning. Marcus knew this. He had been part of that framework for every one of those 12 years. Not in the grand positions, not at the ceremonial tables where the agreements were signed and the images were taken. He had spent most of those years doing the same thing he had always done, the work that didn't photograph well. Logistics. Coordination. The maintenance of communication channels between parties who sometimes desperately wanted to stop communicating. The management of incidents that, handled badly, could have unraveled everything, and which were handled carefully because someone was always in the room who remembered what it had cost to get to the room in the first place. He was 51 years old. His hair had gone gray at the temples in a way that people told him was distinguished, which he understood was what people said when they meant old. He had 2 commendations on his service record and a retirement package that had been offered to him 3 times in the last 4 years, which he had declined each time without extensive explanation. He was in a conference room on the Meridian Accord Station, a facility that hadn't existed 12 years ago, that had been constructed in the inner belt specifically to serve as neutral ground for the trilateral communication structure, when the aide came to the door and told him that his guest had arrived. He had known this meeting was coming. It had been scheduled for 6 months, delayed twice for logistical reasons, and had been described in the official correspondence as a commemorative consultation on the 12th anniversary of the Threshold Accords, which was the name the framework had eventually acquired. The unofficial description, the one Marcus carried in his own mind, was different. He walked down the corridor toward the reception dock and thought about an airlock on Karev Station. About 4 seconds. About a decision that had seemed simple at the time because the only complication was fear, and fear was, in Marcus's experience, almost never a good reason to not do something. The door to the reception dock opened. Cale was taller than Marcus remembered, which made no biological sense and was almost certainly the distortion of memory, the way significant people grow in their absence and return to their actual dimensions in person. The plates had changed color slightly over 12 years, grayer now, less of the strong gray-green with a quality that Marcus had learned in his years of engagement with the Veth, meant something like the visual equivalent of weathering. Age worn openly without apology. The sensory structure oriented on him the moment he entered the room. And the bioluminescence was gold. Not cycling, not shifting, steady gold, full and warm, the shade Marcus had first seen in a medical bay when a dying creature had heard him say its name. They did not shake hands. That gesture had been discussed at length in the early years of cross-cultural protocol development and had been determined to carry a register of formal contractual greeting in Veth interaction norms that was several degrees too transactional for this particular meeting. Instead, Cale extended one hand, open, plates facing upward, and Marcus placed his own hand in it. The same gesture as 12 years ago in the monitoring room. Both of them remembering it. They sat. The official meeting, the commemorative consultation, was on the schedule for later in the day, with interpreters and documentation and the full formal apparatus of established diplomatic procedure. This time, this room, this conversation, was not that. This had been arranged quietly, requested by Cale through back channels that both of them still maintained because formal channels were necessary but insufficient, and because some things could only be said in the original register. They used the hybrid language. 12 years had refined it considerably. It was not elegant but it was precise, and both of them had spent enough time in it that the gaps were mostly navigable. I have wanted to have this conversation for a long time, Cale said. The tap sequences were almost automatic now, the patterns so familiar that Marcus parsed them without conscious translation. Me too, Marcus said. I owe you a debt. Cale's plates shifted, the light cycling briefly through the complex blue of deep thought. Not only for the airlock, for everything after. The 14 months on Karev Station. The communication development. The negotiation. The 30 days and what came after that. You paid it, Marcus said. Multiple times over. You gave us the warning. You gave us the context for the negotiation. You gave us, he paused, choosing words. You gave us a way to understand what we were dealing with that we couldn't have gotten any other way. I know what I gave, Cale tapped. I'm trying to say something about what you gave in return. Pause. The bioluminescence shifted slowly, gold deepening to something richer. When I dragged myself to Airlock 7, I was, as you know, near death. I had made a calculation. I had looked at the data on humanity and concluded that you were worth the risk. But a calculation and a certainty are different things. I was afraid. Another pause. Not of dying. I had made peace with that possibility. I was afraid that I was wrong. That my calculation was incorrect. That I had spent my professional life learning to read civilizations and I had read yours incorrectly and I was going to die having made a mistake that would leave my own people more isolated than before. Marcus waited. You stayed in the airlock. You holstered your weapon before I gave you any reason to believe I was safe. I have thought about that moment, that specific 4-second interval, for 12 years. I have discussed it with colleagues, with VETH analysts who study human behavior, with the convergence assessors who now study both our species. Everyone has theories about what you were thinking. Do you want to know? Marcus asked. I have always wanted to know. Marcus considered it honestly, the way he had not been asked to before. I was thinking that you were obviously hurt and obviously not a threat at that moment and that if I shot something that was hurt and unthreatening I would have a harder time living with myself than if I didn't shoot it and was wrong. I was thinking that the downside of helping you was manageable and the downside of not helping you felt permanent. A long silence. That is, Cale tapped, almost exactly what the human behavioral analysts predicted. Pause. They were unable to convince the convergence that this is a common human reasoning pattern and not an anomaly. The convergence's assessors have spent 11 years arguing about whether you are simply more risk-tolerant or whether your species has a genuinely different framework for what constitutes a threat. What do you think? I think, Cale said, that your species made a decision very early in your history, or perhaps had it decided for you by your circumstances, that the unknown is more likely to be an opportunity than a danger. And I think that this is, objectively, an unusual thing to believe, and that most civilizations do not believe it, and that the ones that survive the longest are the ones who find some version of it eventually. The gold light was steady and warm. I crossed the border to warn you because I believed you could protect yourself and others. I was right about that. But I have thought about it for 12 years and I believe now that the more important thing, the thing that made everything after possible, was not your capacity to fight. It was that capacity to stay in the airlock. Marcus looked at Cale, at the sensory structure that had oriented on him in Crisis 14 years ago and had never fully looked away since. You changed what was possible, Marcus said. Not me. You made the choice that required the most courage, across the most uncertainty, with the most at stake. I just opened a door. You stayed, Cale replied. That is not nothing. In my experience, a pause, bioluminescence shifting to something warm and textured, 12 years of hard-won meaning behind it, staying is almost always the most difficult part. Outside the conference room, the Meridian Accord station hummed with the presence of 3 civilizations maintaining a relationship that had been improbable from the beginning. In 6 hours there would be a formal ceremony. There would be statements and records and photographs that historians would use as markers. But the thing those records would describe had not started in a ceremony. It had started in 4 seconds. In a choice to stay. In a light that turned gold in the dark. Marcus thought about something Solis had asked him once, a long time ago on a station that felt like another life. You think they're watching us? He looked at Cale. At the bioluminescence, warm and certain. I think we watch each other, he said quietly. Cale's plates shifted in the small precise movement that Marcus had learned, somewhere in the middle of all those years, meant something between agreement and gratitude and yes. A Veth word that combined all 3 because in Cale's language, as Cale had once explained with what might have been humor, there had never been a reason to separate them. The debt was paid. Or perhaps it had never been a debt at all. Perhaps it had simply been, from the beginning, 2 different kinds of courage recognizing each other across the distance of everything that made them different and finding, to neither one's complete surprise, that the distance was smaller than it looked.